Hey there, it's Jeremiah. A quick message before the show. Thank you all for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Patrons get access to bonus episodes that are patron exclusive, our Sticker of the Month Club, and they get access to our community Slack, where you can hang out with like-minded people and discuss politics, economics, world events, and more. Become a patron today at patreon.com/neoliberalproject, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Nolan Gray. He's a professional city planner and a housing researcher at UCLA, and he's also the author of the new book, Arbitrary Lines: How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. And that's the topic of today's show, is zoning. What's the history of zoning? What function does it supposedly serve? What impact does it really have? And what should we do with zoning policy in America? Nolan Gray, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeremiah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very excited to have you. I was very excited when you announced you were doing this book a year ago, at least, maybe more than a year ago. And having gotten to read it now, I've got to say it was a really fun read. And I learned a lot of things about the history of zoning that I didn't know before. So I think that's a good place to start off. Can you talk a little bit about how the modern system of zoning, especially American zoning, came to be? Because for most of U.S. history, zoning was not a thing. It was just cities kind of were built in a more, I don't want to say like chaotic way or anarchic way, but in a sense it was a little bit more like that. There were some regulations, there was some stuff going on, there was some planning, but there was not this kind of overarching system. So how did the overarching system of zoning that we do have today come to pass?
Yeah. So it's a great question, a big question. So for most of human history, right, cities don't have anything resembling zoning. And of course, that's not to say that cities before zoning were these fantastic, wonderful places, right? Of course, cities had a lot of issues, particularly with the rise of industrialization, improvements in building technology that allowed densities never before seen, improvements in transportation technologies allowed for horizontal expansion of cities. So cities are going under a lot in the late 19th, early 20th century. And around this time too, land use regulation is actually changing a lot, right? So we're getting stricter and stricter regulation for things like housing codes or building codes, very rudimentary environmental regulation springing up around this time. And to a certain extent, you have things that kind of look like zoning, but don't have a lot of the baggage that we associate with zoning. So, for example, cities will say, okay, you can have industry here, but not there, broadly speaking, right? Or you might have height limits, but they're generally calibrated around actual health and safety considerations, right? Um, Zoning comes in and does something somewhat related to those issues, but also, as I argue in the book, very different, right? So zoning says, we're going to give the power over to planners to comprehensively break the city out into districts, and those districts are going to do two things. They're going to say what land use is permitted in every single district. So, of course, at the broad level, that means residential, commercial, and industrial. But then there's lots of finer details within that. So you can have single family homes here, apartments there, supermarkets here, offices there. At the same time, these districts say how much density you can build everywhere. So, for example, they tell you how much floor area you can build on every given lot in a city. The official story, that's kind of gone down in history to explain what's going on here is that, okay, cities were going through a lot. There was, factories sprouting up next to homes. There was totally uncoordinated growth. There was no regulation. And so we needed zoning to come in and solve that. Um, I dive into the history and look at some of the original materials and argue that the origins of zoning are actually very different. And in many cases don't have a lot to do with what we would think of as maybe traditional externality management or traditional growth management.
Well, because
And if you
that's been happening forever, right? Like one of the examples I think from like classic medieval Europe anyway is like tanneries, which, to tan leather or whatever to make this stuff are a horrible, awful place that smells terrible. And they were always relegated to like the outside of town. But that was done kind of in an ad hoc way where they would just tell the tanneries, like, you have to go outside the walls of the walled city or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you would see that for there would be lots of rules for specific uses that tended to be offensive, right? So, and it wasn't just for specific instances of it. They would say, hey, if you want to operate a tannery or a slaughterhouse, you have to be maybe outside the municipal limits, or you have to be so far away from where residences are. So, we had stuff like that before zoning, and as I'll talk, maybe we'll talk about later in this conversation, cities that don't have zoning still have stuff like that. But zoning comes in and promises to do this big, very high modernist kind of comprehensive planning project. And kind of working in the background there, I think is the real kind of focus of what Euclidean zoning was trying to do, which was trying to do two things: increase property values for incumbent property owners, so restrict the supply of new, for example, office construction and housing construction, and also to segregate cities. At that time, the main focus was on the basis of race, but of course also on the basis of class. And in the American context, those two things are interrelated.
Yeah, so I want to dive into that a little more because I love that you referenced high modernism. It's something I was going to bring up if you didn't. If anyone's ever read James Scott, Seeing Like a State is a book that really influenced me. It talks about how high modernism was this movement around the early 1900s, especially. I'm going to fudge a lot of details here, but a movement that basically said we can scientifically plan society. We can plan society. We are rational engineers and bureaucrats and managers who can determine with our new scientific tools the best way, the optimal way for society to be. And that, I think, was a driving force for a lot of things in the 1900s, was this kind of scientific management idea. And James Scott pushes back on that, and he's obviously not a fan of this. He thinks that that conceit is not true, but it's very true that it was an important force. And so you've kind of got these almost like liberal technocrats in a sense. The technocrats of the 1900s, early 1900s, they were all in on this kind of planning and scientific zoning and things like that. And then you've also got this kind of more reactionary, like, to be blunt about it, like, get the black people out of my neighborhood kind of force that is very much pro-zoning, and they're in favor of it for different reasons. Can you talk about how those things interact, I guess? Because it seems like two very different political forces that are both kind of ending up in this pro-zoning camp. Does this make for like a weird alliance?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to bring another sort of bit of political theory in here, um, there's this concept of Baptist and bootleggers, right? So the notion is that you need coalitions that include people who maybe have a cynical vested stake, maybe a financial stake in a policy change, aligning with people who provide moral cover or provide maybe an ideological argument for the policy change. So, of course, the classic example is the Baptist and the bootlegger who support prohibition, right? So the Baptist supports prohibition because he or she is personally ideologically opposed to alcohol consumption. And then the bootlegger supports prohibition because this person can sell alcohol and make money, and their market would be destroyed if alcohol were legal. I think if you actually look at the early history of zoning, you get a pretty clear Baptist and bootlegger coalition in every case. And I would argue that the bootlegger was the driving force in most of these cases. So in the book, I profile two cities that adopted zoning in 1916, which was when the first zoning code started to come online. And in the New York City case, of course, the Baptists are these sort of proto modernist thinkers who are like, we can sit down and comprehensively plan out New York City and deal with traffic congestion and deal with all these other issues. And then the bootleggers are a mix of lower Manhattan office landlords who are, basically getting hosed by a lot of new supply coming online and lowering office rents. And then also the Fifth Avenue Association, which then and now represents a very posh commercial shopping area. And now, if you look at some of these documents superficially, what was the Fifth Avenue Association concerned about? Well, they were concerned about industry, textiles creeping close to Fifth Avenue. And you read that with a modern lens and you think, okay, those textiles must have been noisy, or they must have had emissions, or they must have generated, some sort of industrial traffic. And that must have been it. But if you actually look at what they say, well, the reason that we're concerned about these factories is the type of person who works at a factory. For example, in that case, it's poor Jewish factory girls from maybe Eastern Europe on their lunch breaks or after work are, if they're close to Fifth Avenue, they're going to be walking along Fifth Avenue, and the Fifth Avenue's Association, as representatives, claim that this is scaring off their clientele. It's a very similar dynamic in Berkeley, right? So Berkeley, California, adopts zoning in 1916 as well. Somewhat famously, they adopt the first zoning code that actually has single-family zoning, which bans apartments in certain residential areas. That's a sort of a keystone for zoning and segregation.
That noise you
But
just
they make
heard,
similar.
that noise you just heard was thousands of listeners all hissing at the same time.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that in a minute, absolutely, and we can deal with single family zoning. But Berkeley is making similar claims, right? They're saying like, okay, we have to stop industry from going into residential neighborhoods. And again, you're reading that and you're like, okay, that's like really compelling. Like I don't want an oil refinery moving into my cul-de-sac. And then look at the original sources and what industry are they talking about? They're talking about Chinese-run laundromats. Like that's the use that they're really concerned about. And it's not necessarily any externality associated with the use that we might think of in the modern sense, but oh, this use is bringing in a certain type of person into my neighborhood and I don't want them here.
And this is why you say in the book, I'm going to read a quote, zoning is not a good institution gone bad. It has always been bad, essentially.
Yeah, I think I'm a trained planner. I guess I probably have let my AICP lapse at this point. Haven't been doing my continuing education. Don't don't get mad at
There's
me.
another
But yeah,
conversation
I
here
did.
about occupational licensing, but we won't get into that.
Well, it's purely voluntary in every state except for New Jersey, and New Jersey is the only state that licensed planners, and that's why New Jersey is so well planned, as everybody knows. Um, so yeah, this is what I'm trying to push back on with that early portion of the book explaining what zoning is and where it comes from. Is I think there's this planning school planning mythology of zoning that's it really is just that like, oh, before zoning came online, we had factories opening up next to elementary schools, and we just had totally chaotic and uncontrolled growth. And then zoning came in and solved all that. And, that's definitely like an argument that some people are giving for zoning early on, but just a pure reading of the original sources doesn't suggest that that was the main reason that zoning was adopted. And that certainly wasn't the main function that it fulfilled by any stretch of the imagination.
So when I read a book on something like this, a housing book, for instance, I'm always looking for kind of what's going to be the differentiating factor here. Because if you read enough books, and I'm sure you've experienced this, you're doing a PhD in urban planning, basically. If you read enough of these books, you at some point you get sick of like reading the 10th book that tells you, yes, zoning bad, build housing good. And you're always kind of like, all right, well, what's the unique insight here? What's the unique angle? And certainly the history of zoning, I thought, was actually covered in a lot more depth here than I've read before. Another thing that I noticed that I felt like this book did a little bit better than other books that I've read was actually really get into the nitty-gritty of how zoning works in terms of land use categories and, floor area ratios and setbacks and maximum lot coverages and things like that. So I'd love to spend just a few minutes. We don't want to go like crazy deep here, but talking about like the nuts and bolts of like how does zoning actually work? When we say zoning, what actually are we talking about in a typical city? And if you want to use like an example city, feel free to do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, this is partly why I wanted to write the book, right? When I first started getting into zoning, probably 10 years ago or so now, it was a very boring issue, right? Like you know how like if you don't want to talk about your work, right? Somebody asks you what you do, you just say you're an accountant, right? And nobody will ask any follow-up questions. No disrespect to the accountant listeners, I love you guys. But it used to be the case you could say, well, I researched zoning, right? And it would elicit similar reactions, just a blank stare and then a politely changed conversation. Nowadays, everyone is really, really interested in zoning, and you can't open up, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal without seeing editorials on zoning. It's in many cities the number one kind of one of the number one policy issues that people are thinking about, or it underwrites the number one, the big issues that people are thinking about, like homelessness, housing affordability, sustainability. And that's all well and good, but before I wrote the book, I found that people often kind of only had a very vague sense of what zoning was. So for example, I would be making the case like, hey, we need to liberalize zoning, and somebody would say something like, oh, well, like, I think it's important that we preserve some buildings. And I would say, well, preservation ordinance is a completely separate thing from zoning, separate issues, but I'm not arguing for getting rid of that. Or people would say things like, well, we can't just allow buildings to get built without, undergoing building inspections. Like, that would be ridiculous. And same thing, right? Like building code is also a separate thing from zoning. It's very different. And so I just wanted to, I spend a chapter in the book explaining what zoning is. And then I include an appendix which explains, where zoning fits within this broader ecosystem of planning. So the 5,000-foot view, of course, interested readers will have to buy the book to get the full story and get their full $30 worth. But the 5,000-foot view of how planning works in a U.S. city is your city adopts a comprehensive plan. This is meant to be a big picture plan for how the city is going to change over a given time frame, maybe like 20 years, depending on the local conditions. This is going to, set out everything like demographics, economic change, where infrastructure is going to need to be built, et cetera. And within that, a whole bunch of different plans exist, right? So a plan for maybe protecting wetlands, or a plan for, guiding infrastructure investments, or a plan for opening new schools, right? All of that's going to live within this comprehensive plan. And then there are a whole bunch of different ordinances doing different things. So I've already mentioned a few, right? You have building codes which regulate the actual health and safety of new construction. You have things like preservation ordinances, which preserve certain historic assets. You might even have environmental review for properties undergoing development. There's a whole bunch of different ordinances, and zoning is one element within that, right? So, in the book, I make the case for, that zoning has failed to do everything that we want it to do. To the extent that it's succeeded, it's mainly doing things that we don't want city planning to do. We should abolish it, and we should start thinking about a system of land use regulation that actually does the things we want planning to do, such as regulate externalities, or plan out growth in coordination with infrastructure. And so when you actually understand what zoning is, it's a much more, I think, reasonable case. So zoning really is just the system that we use to segregate land uses, and in many cases with very, very, very fine levels of detail in pursuit of segregationist aims, more often than not, and restrict density. So just make it harder to build in existing cities, make it harder for cities to build up, which of course forces them to build out. And I think when you have this kind of proper understanding of what zoning is, it becomes a little bit more obvious. Like, okay, well, like, yeah, this system doesn't jive with our current values, but we can do better, right? There are things that we want land use regulation to do. Zoning doesn't achieve them, but we can get those rules in place.
So when we talk about very fine levels of regulation here and very fine levels of detail about what you can and cannot do, I think it's important to actually get into some of that detail, because some people are going to agree in the abstract with, yeah, zoning can be bad, but, not all zoning is bad. And surely there's some cities with pretty good zoning. So let's talk about like the sheer number of things that go into this. And I'll start us off with an example from the book, and then we can contrast it to something else. So in the book, you talk about Japanese zoning, where for the entire country of Japan, there's something like 14 different land uses. And, they range from maybe industrial to residential, maybe some commercial stuff in there. But for the whole country, they've basically got 14 big categories, if I'm remembering that right. How does something like that, the Japanese system, which is pretty simple, compare to a big American city? Like we could say New York, because I know that you've worked as a New York City planner. You're probably most familiar with what's going on in New York.
Yeah, so I would say there are a few differences. So, for example, the first, just substance, right? In Japanese zoning, there's nothing like single-family zoning. So, just to kind of go over it again for people who haven't already heard the good news, single-family zoning says you can only build for example, a detached single family home on a 5,000 square foot lot. And in many cases, this is the zoning district that applies to roughly 70 to 95% of the typical American city. That means you can't build any duplexes, you can't build any homes on smaller lots, you can't build any apartment buildings in these huge tracts of US cities. It also means you can't do things like corner groceries or maybe a corner barbershop or a corner medical office, things that were very, very, very common in neighborhoods before zoning rose up. In Japanese zoning, even the most restrictive zoning district allows low-rise multifamily. It allows home offices. It allows small corner shops that most people actually want to have in their neighborhood. That's, I think, one big difference. I think another big difference is process. So in Japan, the permitted zoning districts that can be mapped are defined at the national level, right? So as you mentioned, there are only so many different zoning designations that can be mapped. Compare that to the US context, where basically every incorporated municipality reinvents the wheel and writes its own zoning code, and such that you honestly can't understand. For example, if I'm a developer in Louisville, Kentucky, I can't just crack open the Lexington, Kentucky zoning code and immediately sort of make sense of it, right? These are very, very, very different codes. It makes it very hard to have national real estate markets, and I think that's actually a really, really important thing.
So you're saying
And
in Japan, it's easy for someone who is they build apartments in Kyoto. It would be very easy for them to go to Osaka or Tokyo and just start building there because the regulations are almost exactly the same or working off the same framework at least.
it would be much easier than it is here in the U.S., for example. So in the U.S., if I'm a New York developer and I want to build in L.A., I'm almost certainly going to have to hire an L.A. attorney, probably an L.A. planner, an entire team of people who are going to get my permits because I don't know how that whole ecosystem works. I'd say the third difference, and this is another process difference. Part of the original pitch of zoning was, okay, we're going to set clear rules for what's allowed where, and if a proposed development follows those rules, it's going to get its permits. Nowadays, it's very, very different. It still works like that, in large part in Japan. If you're compliant with the underlying zoning, you get your permits. That's a better way to do zoning. Here in the US, we've moved more and more to a system that involves a lot of discretion, right? So because this is partly because zoning is so strict that almost every development proposal that involves building apartments or building a mixed use development is going to have to come in and ask for relief from the zoning because it's not going to be allowed. So that, developers are going to have to say, hey, please let me build ground floor retail on this apartment building, or hey, please let me build fewer parking spaces. I don't want to build this giant parking garage and my customers don't need it.
Some of the terminology here would be like as of right zoning versus
Exactly.
discretionary zoning, right? And you're saying that because people have to ask for, I guess what you'd call variances, please let me change the rules a little bit because they're so strict, that then it has to go through this famous process that this is what we see in places like San Francisco, right? Where I don't know, you have to have 20 town halls about how you're going to cast a shadow on a park or something like that. Is the discretionary zoning is the reason we have that whole process, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so in San Francisco, for example, they do something called site plan review, which basically says like, yeah, even if you follow the zoning and you follow all the regulations on the books, we're still just gonna like, have discretionary rights over whether or not we give you your permit. And in California, of course, that's doubly an issue because in California, any government action that's discretionary requires environmental review. So this is, of course, the infamous CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, which requires the applicant to do this, massive environmental study, even if it's like they're building a fourplex in an existing urban neighborhood, to do this massive environmental study. And then, of course, they can be sued by neighbors who don't like it on super frivolous grounds, and it can delay the project. And in many cases, it stops a lot of small projects from happening. But so that's a way you can do zoning better, is to say, hey, we're going to return to this original ideal, and we're going to return to how it works in a country like Japan, and say, if you follow the rules, you're going to get your permit.
Another thing that struck me, and I think this is an example from the book, is just the sheer number of things that you have available to you. And maybe this is because every city does its own thing, but I think there was an example in the book about, whereas Japan has 14 categories in the entire country, New York City by itself has, I forget the exact number, like 150 different categories of things that you can do, of types of land use, whether it's very hyper specific things or, residential broken into 10 different residential categories or whatever the case may be. I also just think beyond the use, commercial versus residential versus industrial, there's also just so much stuff in terms of how tall can the building be? How many units can you have for how much floor? How much do you have to be set back from the street? How many parking spots do you have to have? Like, is that a factor here? Because I know you talk about it in the book in terms of just the sheer number of things that you have to comply with.
Yeah, no, that's a huge factor, and you do a really good job listing it off there. So I think most people are familiar with height limits, right? Like I think that, the superficial understanding of zoning is like, okay, yeah, we have height limits. But exactly as you say, right, it's really not just height limits. Zoning is really in many contexts defining the exact form of what every single building looks like. So, in addition to height limits, it is stuff like setbacks. How far setback from the street do you have to be from the rear and side lot lines? A really, really important one, which you touch on, is parking. So most U.S. cities, the zoning code mandates that for every residential unit you build, you have to build so much parking, regardless of what your intended home buyer or renter wants. Right? You might be building an apartment building right next to a subway station in an area with a lot of walkable retail, and your prospective renter might not have a car at all. But zoning still forces that developer to actually build parking spaces, regardless of what the market wants. And then, of course, that has a whole bunch of different knock-on issues for cities.
Can you tell me if I'm wrong here? Doesn't parts of New York City still have parking requirements for certain, like the outer boroughs? If you build anything there, you have to have a certain amount of parking, even in New York City.
Even in New York City, yeah. So
And
I
that's
believe
insane to me. Like if there's one place in America, just one single place that you shouldn't have to provide parking spaces, you would think it would be New York City.
I hear you. I mean, yeah. So the New York City basically had an air quality crisis. I believe it was in the 70s, and the EPA basically forced New York City to get rid of parking requirements in Manhattan, and they've provided some parking relief near transit. But yeah, there are large parts of the city where if you build an apartment building, you might be in a neighborhood that has, storefronts within walking distance or regular bus service to Midtown, but you still will have to build parking.
All right, so there's a lot more we could get into here. We can't review the entire book, and I encourage people to read it because you can talk about, not just the front setback, but the side setback and the back setback and maximum lot coverages and minimum lot
Hmm.
sizes and, not just the floor area ratio, but how many units per floor area ratio. There's all kinds of how you could get into hierarchical versus flat zoning. And we're not going to have time to go through like every one of these, but this is a buy the book moment where if anybody's interested, go buy the book. It's a good read. But now we have to transition to talking about why does this matter? So we've described this insanely complicated system, the history of it, why the U.S. system is so insanely complicated, probably because it's controlled at a local level and it's subject to all sorts of local political forces that distort it to their own means. But at some point, we run into the question, why does this matter? The thesis of the book is that this has negative effects. So can you talk a little bit from a high level view, why does zoning matter and what are the negative effects here in your mind?
Absolutely. So in the book, I argue that zoning has done at least four things. So the first is it's a key culprit in the current housing affordability crisis that's increasingly sweeping the nation. So we talk about that long list of rules and things like apartment bans or strict rules banning um, building so many more units on a lot than a given amount, or requiring homes to sit on really large lots, or requiring apartments to come with parking garages. All of these things to, one way or another, make housing more expensive. In the book, I suggest they do this in three ways. So the first is just outright banning housing, right? So as I mentioned, in most US cities, it's illegal to build apartments in huge chunks of the city. And not just apartments, but also things like townhouses, duplexes, cottage courts, traditional housing typologies that kept cities affordable. The second is by requiring that the housing that is built is of a higher quality than consumers might have otherwise preferred, right? So, I talked about how we have building regulations to make sure that buildings are safe and, meet actual globally defined health and safety standards, and they do a very good job of that. All zoning does is add an additional layer onto that of other requirements. So it says, okay, yeah, the building code says that units only have to be 2,500, let's say, or excuse me, let's say 250 square feet. But in our city, we're not going to allow you to build a home unless it's 2,000 square feet. Or we're not going to allow you to build a home unless it comes with two off-street parking spaces. Or we're not going to allow you to build a home unless it's on a lot of at least a half an acre. All of these things don't, on one level, make housing illegal to build, but they say that if you build it, it has to be much more expensive than it might otherwise have been. And then the third way that it makes housing more expensive is all of this regulatory delay, the stuff that we talked about with discretionary permitting, where it's increasingly difficult and expensive and unreliable just to get your permits. And all of this stuff, of course, adds costs and ultimately makes housing more expensive. And we could talk about some of the other stuff. I also argue, for example, from a national perspective, right? I think one argument that you might get is, well, like I own my house or I live in a city that we still have pretty low housing prices. Why should I care about this stuff? There's a lot of great research out there now that suggests that land use constraints in our most productive cities, this is places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, has actually made us collectively less wealthy, right? So by making it hard for that young software engineer to move to the Bay Area, or for making it hard for that young medical researcher to move to Boston, we're all collectively worse off, right? And there's extensive economic research on this. Historically, Americans moved from poor, lower productivity regions to richer, higher productivity regions, right? A very famous example of this being the Great Migrations of African Americans out of the South and into what were at the time very wealthy industrial Midwestern cities and Northeastern cities. Now Americans do the opposite. So they move from highly productive, rich, but in many cases housing constrained cities to less productive, less wealthy, but housing abundant places in the Midwest and Sunbelt. And of course, there's an asterisk on that housing abundant because as we've seen over the last 2 years, as people have started making this move in huge numbers, the housing crisis has basically just been exported nationwide.
I mean, that's pretty comprehensive. I think it's interesting to note that there's really several reasons why this makes your rent go up. Because the thing that's going to hit people most is, saying, look, zoning causes your rent to go up. And this is potentially going to be a divide among the renting class and the owning class, which is something I think about a lot. But it's not, a lot of people zero in on this makes your rent more expensive because there's less supply and demand. If there's a shortage of something, prices go up. That's pretty easy, right? But I think it's underrated, and people don't talk as much about how some of the other factors that you talk about, like this mandates that units be larger in a lot of cases. In huge swaths of most cities, there's basically a requirement that units be a certain size, and you can't build housing units, whether it's homes, detached family homes, or apartments underneath a certain size. And so, of course, if you have a requirement that the units be large, they're going to cost more. If you have a requirement that they have to meet more regulations or provide more parking, that's going to cost more. And I think we honestly don't do enough to emphasize that side of it, that it's not just a supply and demand thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you raised the point about renters versus landlords, right? And I think to a certain extent,
Well,
right, the
I
status.
wouldn't even say renters versus landlords. I would say renters versus just people who own their own units. Again, whether they
Right.
own a single family home or they own a condo in a city or whatever the case. There's a different set of incentives there potentially.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And in one sense, right, the status quo is actually very good for that latter category of people who already own their property, because of the housing shortage, the value of their asset is going up, right? And so on the one hand, this seems really good for them. I would argue that it's still very much not a situation that they want to persist for a few reasons. The first is just for, that argument that I was making about economic growth, right? If we make it hard for people to move into the most productive places, we're just all poorer and worse off. But that's kind of abstract. People don't really think in those terms of like, GDP growth that we could have had, but we lost. The way that people do think though is, okay, like I want my kids to live near me, right? Like if I'm a homeowner in San Jose, my children have basically no path to homeownership, within like 2 hours of where I live, right? My kids are basically going to have to move to Phoenix or Las Vegas or Denver, any number of other cities where like working class Californians are moving in droves.
And what percent of San Jose is single family zoned?
Well, so the vast majority of it, recent state laws, you could argue, are potentially going to change that. So, for example, California, this is something that we can talk about when we talk about making zoning less bad. Accessory dwelling units have been legalized statewide in California, which is going to help a little bit. Recent bills like SB 9 have made it legal to subdivide properties and build duplexes or fourplexes in some cases. That's going to help a little bit. But the actual zoning on the book in San Jose would still lead you to believe, and to a large extent is still the case, that single family zoning is still in place in something like 80 to 90% of the city.
I'd love to dive a little bit more into the history of this being used essentially for racial segregation, because you write in the book about how this was a pretty explicit goal, both at the very beginning. You use the example of in 1916, New York's Fifth Avenue didn't want, Eastern European Jewish workers walking up and down their avenue where all the rich people were. This is also true when zoning starts to expand more nationally through the 40s and 50s and 60s, when it really kind of explodes nationwide. There's a lot of places that very explicitly use this to just keep black people in one part of town. And sometimes they had the common sense, I guess, to not say it out loud, but there were actually places where they would literally just say white neighborhood or black neighborhood on official government documents. Now, that doesn't happen anymore, but do you think that zoning is still essentially being used, even if it's in an unofficial or in kind of an unintended way, as a tool of racial segregation?
Yeah. So just to go back to that kind of like early history, right? Back to basics. In 1917, the Supreme Court, in a rare moment of clarity during this period, overturns explicitly racial zoning. So in the early 19 teens, a whole bunch of cities in the South and the upper South, lower Midwest, adopt zoning codes that fairly explicitly say black people can live here and white people can live here, and there's not going to be any more mixing than there currently is. Supreme Court overturns that in Buchanan v. Worley with respect specifically to Louisville, Kentucky, which had adopted a racial zoning ordinance. And the immediate aftermath of that, all of these cities are scrambling for an alternative way to institute segregation, but without explicitly mentioning race. And very conveniently, of course, just in 1916, the first what we call Euclidean zoning codes had come online. This is zoning as it exists today in the United States. And so exactly as you mentioned, a lot of these cities used superficially race-blind zoning to pursue racial segregation. And they did this through the means of economic exclusion. So, for example, as we were talking about previously, many U.S. cities allow apartments in some parts of town and not in others. Or minimum lot sizes, for example, many cities will say, okay, in this area of town, the minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet. In this area of town, the minimum lot size is 15,000 square feet. If you can determine how expensive housing is going to be in one part of town or an entire suburb, you effectively have the power to determine who can and can't live in that area. And of course, in the US context, that economic exclusion tracks very closely onto race. I think that this, is very clearly still an issue in U.S. cities today. And you see coded language, right? When you tune into some of these zoning hearings, people talk about character. They use, we got to protect the community character. That's not, they'll talk about apartments and they'll say it's just not the type of thing that belongs around here. they'll use like very polite or sometimes technical sounding, so that, oh, like we just don't have the capacity for that fourplex on this street. We'd have to upgrade all of our sewers if we install, an ADU here. They use like very nice coded or, superficially technical language, but the actual outcomes of what they're pursuing is exactly, I think, the racial and economic segregation that underwrote early zoning adoption.
All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit in the last portion of this podcast, and let's talk about politics. There's an interesting angle to this book where kind of right away you start talking about how you think we should completely abolish zoning. And this almost reminds me of fights that have been happening on the left about how we message our policies and what we should advocate for, because you don't say, well, we need to reform zoning, or we need to get rid of single family zoning, or we need to simplify zoning. You come swinging out the gate and say zoning is bad. It's always been bad. Virtually everything it does is bad. And we should just abolish the system of zoning that we have entirely. And, I think about this, and I think about the fight over abolish the police, defund the police that happened. And, some people genuinely wanted to abolish the police. Some people just meant defund the police as a squishy way to say fund social services and blah, blah, blah. And there's a big fight that happens. And it's easy for me to punch at leftists here because I'm a neoliberal. And it's easy to punch at the leftists and say, you idiots for saying defund the police. But we have a similar thing going on with open borders where, regardless of whether you really believe in open borders or you just want to increase immigration or whatever, you have to acknowledge open borders is pretty toxic politically to say out loud. So I guess I'll ask you, with all of this said, with this kind of background of the environment that we are in, why should we just I guess there's two questions. Number one, why should we abolish zoning instead of just going to something like Japanese zoning? And number two, is this the best way to message it?
Jeremiah, we're tiptoeing around a lot of very beautiful issues. This is exciting. I love that question too, by the way. It's the first time I've been asked that question. Uh, so I want to be very clear. There's an entire chapter of my book on how we can make zoning less bad. And I think that's a perfectly valid way for example, the YIMBY movement or neoliberals to be focusing their energy. In the past few years, we have made a lot of progress on making zoning significantly less bad, abolishing things like parking requirements, abolishing things like single family zoning, lowering minimum lot sizes. I don't want to begrudge anyone who's doing that work. And that's actually how I spend most of my time, is talking to policymakers trying to make zoning less bad. But of course, as you suggest, I think that in the long term, the play here is going to be basically scrapping this broken system and hitting the reset button on how we regulate urban land. The SparkNotes version of why I make that argument is a few things. First, in the US, we have habituated people, and in many cases written into our tax code, to think of their home as an investment. And so I think as long as that's the case, people are going to be extremely conservative about what gets built around them. And they're going to actually have a perverse stake in housing scarcity, and they're always going to agitate potentially on some level for policies that make housing more scarce. Of course, we can do things that make that less likely. So, abolish the mortgage interest deduction, get rid of some of these capital gains, preferential treatments for housing and land wealth. That's all well and good, and I think we should do that. But in the near term, I just don't see that changing. The second is, I think.
Well, can I stop you there just to clarify? Sure. You're basically making this argument that I've heard before that, look, even if you get rid of single family zoning and you allow density, well, some locality is just going to come up with a rule that you've got to write this ridiculous environmental report. And then even if you go to the state level and say, well, we're going to ban the environmental reports, then they'll do something about, well, you've got to pay for a special sewer inspection. And you're kind of saying no matter what you do, people are going to find a way to try to be exclusionary and try to stop things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, actually. So the two of my advisors at UCLA, Mike Manville and Pablo McConan, have this concept of the regulatory hydra. So you can go, for example, from the state level, right? The current YIMBY path is state level preemption, right? Let's have state governments say to cities, okay, we're not going to allow you to do minimum parking requirements, or we're not going to allow you to have single family zoning, or we're going to give you an allocation of a certain number of units to be built. And those things are perfectly fine to do, especially like extreme like regulations like minimum lot, or excuse me, like minimum parking requirements. Yeah, just take them out of the local toolbox. But I think that's exactly right, that municipalities that have a strong preference for exclusionary zoning policies are going to find ways to get them. And we can continue to play state regulatory whack-a-mole. And eventually we'll get it right. You can look at the history of accessory dwelling units in California. The state of California first started trying to get local governments to legalize ADUs in the 80s. Okay, so we spent 40 years basically getting that right. And I think we got it right now. Like it really is tough for a municipality to ban ADUs, but I don't think 40 years of incremental reform is going to get us the goods, at least not on the time frame that we want. And so I think, another way to think of this is, what are the broader changes that need to happen in the way we regulate land? So, this is we're bundling a few different issues here, but I think the current way we approach this is, okay, well, we're going to go municipality to municipality and we're going to change rules. And again, that's had its successes and that's a perfectly valid thing to do. Another approach is we're going to have state government set rules and play regulatory whack-a-mole with local governments. Again, there's like reasons to do that. But in the bigger picture, right, like I worry that this is just kind of denying what zoning is trying to do at a really basic level. As long as you have extreme municipal fragmentation and people see, have a vested stake in high housing costs, or on some level have segregationist attitudes, even if they're not explicit about them, or you have this idea that cities should be optimized around the car, zoning is always going to revert to, I fear, zoning is always going to revert to this really dysfunctional status quo.
So you think this would be the case even if we had something like Japan's system of zoning?
Yeah, so that might be different, right? So if you had you could do really, really fundamental reforms to zoning in that way, right? So if you had maybe a state government say, okay, here are the 10 zoning districts you can adopt. Yeah, that would be highly desirable. I think that that's just not going to happen given the politics of land use in the U.S. And I think it's at least less likely to happen than the sort of zoning abolition plan that I set out. That we can talk about it, but I actually think it's significantly less radical than abolish zoning might at first seem. I want to touch on that second set of questions you asked, though, of like comparing this to abolish the police or abolish ICE. I share some of your concerns that these are provocative and potentially counterproductive. This is the type of conversation that's like about 50% too nuanced for a platform like Twitter, but these are important conversations to have for people who really want to see positive reform. So to what extent is abolish the zoning, or excuse me, to what extent is abolish zoning the same kind of thing? I think the concerns that you might have about abolish the police or abolish ICE is that when you do opinion surveys on these issues, it's way more complicated and it's way more nuanced, and people report maybe having more favorable attitudes toward police than you might expect. And so if you want, for example, police reform, you don't want to go directly for the police, but you want to couch your issues in different ways. I would say the difference there with abolish zoning is that there's just not really a lot of evidence that zoning is actually popular. So, like within planning, I think we've labored under this assumption that zoning is this popular ground up, thing that everybody loves and that, is you can't get rid of. But, for some of the reasons that I talk about with the histories of zoning, it's this very elite driven, very much driven by interest groups. And then, of course, in a modern context, when you look at a city like Houston, the only major city that actually put zoning to a citywide vote, voters have turned it down. I was just reading too, and this happens all the time. I was just reading about some suburbs of Atlanta where people were trying to incorporate and adopt a zoning code, and the initiatives failed. I actually think that the popularity of zoning has been vastly overstated.
It is interesting to think about how when zoning was adopted, it was mostly by bureaucratic fiat, essentially. It was rare for major cities, at least anyway for major cities, to put this to a vote. I want to move back into kind of fantasy policy land and just to get your view on like what really is the ideal system. Like, say you're in LA right now, you're in UCLA, and say a new growth happens in the Pacific Ocean, we get a whole new state, right? There's a tumor sticking out of California, and we're gonna a new state of New California. It's a new thing in the Pacific Ocean, right? And they say, Nolan, a bunch of people are about to come live here. We're going to build a bunch of cities. You get to decide our zoning code. In like this kind of blank slate scenario, would you go with literally no zoning code, or would you go with some sort of like Japanese system where it's a very, very simple zoning code? What would be the ideal?
Yeah, so we're in the realm of fantasy politics to a certain extent, but we kind of have a model of what this might look like, right? Which is Houston. So Houston, of course, is America's fourth largest city, very large, very diverse, very dynamic, and they don't have zoning. I suggest a few things that we can learn from Houston and that we might want to consider in building a post-zoning city. The first is you do need regulations to deal with things like externalities. And I actually think that zoning is a problem to the extent that it distracts us from these issues, right? So in cities, externalities are a huge issue, right? Stuff like noise, which we do a horrible job of regulating in most US cities as a major public health, mental health consideration. Traffic generation, smoke, vibrations. These are all things that we only really regulate in a very weird, indirect way. I would say, focus regulations on things that actually involve one neighbor impacting another. That's really important. I would say another thing you can do is, you can have something that kind of sort of looks like zoning for the extreme uses that we know are going to offend people. So before zoning, as we were talking about at the top of this conversation, you still had rules saying like, hey, slaughterhouses can't just be anywhere, right? Or, tanneries can't just be anywhere. I don't know how many slaughterhouses and tanneries the modern US city or our mythical city of New California will have, but it'll have like heavy industry that you do want to be sort of careful about. As I argue in the book, there are market forces that are going to drive those most noxious uses to be in a different part of the city. But it makes sense to me that you would have some baseline rules to say, hey, uses of this nature can only be in a certain area of town, or they can't be within so many feet of maybe residential uses or a school. That's perfectly reasonable to me. And then I would say the third piece of the equation is let people who have a preference for stricter land use regulations voluntarily opt into them, right? So land use is weird in the sense that, not everyone's preferences stop at traditional externalities. Some people want to live in a neighborhood that maybe doesn't have a corner grocery, or some people have an extremely strong preference for whatever reason to live in an apartment that's maybe all single family homes that have the same type of architecture. I think sometimes those attitudes are, sometimes those preferences are rooted in troublesome beliefs, but sometimes people just have these preferences and they're going to pursue those preferences one way or another. In most US cities, what we've done is we've said, okay, we're going to invent zoning and we're going to give those people free reign and they're going to get to set all the rules. But in a city like Houston, the compromise that seems to work for them is they say, hey, if you want those added rules, go organize all of your neighbors and voluntarily opt into them and spend some of the cost to actually enforce and oversee these rules. And you know what? You can have them. But what we're not going to let you do is adopt these rules and then have the state enforce them ad infinitum, and then of course enforce your preferences through the entire city. And so that's, I think, the land use planning cocktail that seems to work in a place like Houston.
There are two things that strike me there. The first one is that I feel like it's a very brave choice to hold up Houston as an example of like great urbanism, because there's a lot of hit pieces out on Houston specifically about how it's this unending mess of sprawl and awful design and you can't walk anywhere, and just there's a YouTube channel I like called Not Just Bikes that specifically I think has an entire like 20-minute video about like what an urban hellscape Houston is. So it's a brave choice, and maybe you can comment on that. But the second one is that you seem to be making a case for like planning without zoning, that there's still a place for like city planning in some respect, but without like the zoning codes that define modern American cities.
Well, to address your first question, I mean, my thought, I hear a lot of those critiques, right? Houston made basically every other planning mistake that every other US city made in the 20th century, sometimes to a much more extreme degree, right? No question about it. They completely planned the city around cars. They built these huge urban freeways. They were, way too callous about wetland and wetland development and stormwater management. Absolutely. But would Houston have been better if they adopted zoning in, for example, the 1993 referendum? Would Houston have been better if like Houston had the zoning code that said, okay, on top of all those other planning mistakes, we're going to make this extra planning mistake, which is to adopt zoning and say apartments are illegal in like 80% of the city, And the current townhouse boom that's happening, for example, that never would have happened. All of the 5/1s that are being built in former industrial and commercial areas, those would all be illegal or they would require all types of variances. I contend that the city would not be better if that were to happen, right? And so, I'm very at pains to make this, qualification in the book. Houston's not an all-purpose model for planning. Yeah, and I will say, to give them their due, I think they're actually improving on a lot of these issues faster than most other U.S. cities. So they just adopted a great bicycle master plan. They did a huge bus reorganization. They arguably have significantly better stormwater management. And if you go back and look at, for example, Hurricane Harvey, a lot of the wetlands development was actually in conventionally zoned suburbs. But I'll absolutely concede that Houston's not an all-purpose planning model. But if you actually just carve out and look at land use, this land use element of it, it's actually clear that it's helped to keep the city to be one of the most affordable and now one of the most diverse cities in the country, even as, for example, heavily zoned cities like LA or San Jose trip over themselves trying to overcome the issues that are caused by having a zoning code of the type that Houston probably would have adopted if they had adopted zoning. There was a second question there that I completely forgot.
Yeah. I said you're suggesting that like there's room for planning without zoning.
Yeah, yeah, and that second piece is really important, which I think another one of the main costs of zoning is that it's actually wasted a lot of planning capacity that could have been better used doing things that actually resemble planning. So the like typical U.S. planner today is wasting most of her time, right, like trying to keep fourplexes out of cul-de-sacs or administering a code that does that, or micromanaging the site plan of like strip malls that have 1,000 parking spaces. I would contend that that's like not the best use of our planning civil service capacity, and that these people in many cases are highly skilled civil servants who have a lot to offer to cities and could be doing things that resemble planning, right? So before zoning, many cities actually had street plans. Today, and this is an area where we actually don't do enough planning. This is not an argument for getting rid of planning. This is actually an argument for getting rid of a small dysfunctional part of planning so we can reallocate some of that capacity to more important things. Things like coming up with street plans, things like making sure that we regularly have parks or that public services are equitably distributed, doing things like coordinating affordable housing for people who, even in a housing abundant context, are going to need, income restricted housing. These are all really, really important things that planners could and should be doing. But in many cases, we waste a lot of that capacity managing zoning. And I think a post-zoning city is definitely not going to involve planning. On the contrary, I think it's going to involve a lot more planning and a lot more thoughtful planning.
All right, so we're coming up on time, and I'm going to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, which is, where can people go if they want to learn more? Now, I'll give the first answer, which is everybody should go buy Nolan's book. It's called Arbitrary Lines. You can get it. It comes out on the 21st, which this podcast, it will not quite be out yet when we release this podcast, but you can pre-order it from Amazon or any of your favorite booksellers. I'm sure it's available everywhere. So go buy the book is the first one. But other than your book, if people want to learn about the history of zoning or the details of their city's zoning or just any of the things we've been talking about, what would you recommend that they do to learn more?
Yeah, well, so buy the book. You can follow me on Twitter. I tweet about zoning pretty regularly. Nolan Gray, Gray. In the book, I try to do a lot of things where I invite people to learn by doing, right? So if you're interested in zoning, go look at your city's zoning code, right? I mean, it's going to be complicated and confusing at first, but crack it open. Look up what's the zoning for where you live. What can and can't be built there? What are the rules there? Look at your zoning map. Go to a zoning hearing. See, what type of stuff is kind of getting put through the ringer. Who's showing up to speak at these things? What are they saying? Once you have some familiarity with zoning in your community, take a walk. Are certain streets, right? Are all the buildings the same height? Are all the setbacks the same? Zoning is kind of like a code for the city, for better or worse. And once you start to understand it, you start to understand why we have the cities that we do today, for better or worse. And so, this is actually, I think, a really fun thing about zoning. It's not just this purely. I think it has this. It has this. I think. What's the word I'm looking for?
That's going to be my takeaway from the podcast is zoning is fun, according to Nolan Gray.
Uh, it has this feeling of being really wonky and dry and boring, and I think in a certain way it is, but it's also this thing that lets you understand your city. And so it's not just go read my book and internalize all the lessons and tweet about it. Go out and live it, and go out and learn more about your community, and learn more about what you want land use regulation in your community to actually be doing.
All right. Well, hopefully we will continue to see progress. I'll close on that note where we have been seeing a decent amount of progress in America towards not abolishing zoning, but lifting some of the worst restrictions and some of the worst parts of it. We've seen victories in Minneapolis and Oregon and California and many small towns and smaller cities around the country. And hopefully we will continue to see that. For those who would like it, one more time, the book is Arbitrary Lines. It's by M. Nolan Gray. Nolan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much, Jeremiah. It's a fun conversation.